Some among us are just naturally more daring than the rest of humanity. The lucky amongst us might go through life without facing a dire situation requiring us to dig deep and find the daring devil within. Many are not so fortunate, however, and end up in serious jams that call for every last ounce of daring that they can muster. Following are 17 things about daring moves people use throughout history. Number 17. The daring raid on the Medway. The raid on the Medway was a daring surprise Dutch attack on England's Royal Navy that took place between June 9 to 14, 1667, during the Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665 to 1665. Dutch warships brazenly sailed up the Medway River in Kent to fall upon English warships anchored in dockyards at Chatham and Gillingham. The result was one of the most impressive victories in Dutch history. From the start of the war, things had been going badly for England. First, the country suffered the Great Plague that ravaged London in 1665 to 1666. Then came the Great Fire of London in 1666. By 1667, England's King Charles II was broke, unable to pay sailors, and desperately wanted out of the war. The Dutch, however, smarting from having lost the First Anglo-Dutch War a few years earlier, wanted to first inflict a crushing defeat on the English to even the score, that then placed them in a strong position to impose punitive peace terms on England. Number 16. A devastating blow. To inflict a crushing and humiliating defeat upon England, the Dutch fleet, daring to challenge the English line in its den, entered the Thames estuary. Commanded by one of history's greatest admirals, Michiel de Ruyter, the Dutch bombarded and captured Sheerness at the mouth of the Medway. The attackers then sailed up that river. En route they overcame a barrier chain stretched across the Medway, which Dutch engineers overcame with ease. They also overcame fortresses along the way that were intended to protect the English warships anchored at Chatham and Gillingham. The Dutch reached the anchored English vessels that were laid up in their dockyards, virtually unmanned and unarmed. The attackers burned 3 capital ships and 10 smaller warships. They also captured and towed away as prizes 2 major ships of the line, including HMS Royal Charles, the flagship of the Royal Navy named after the reigning king. In total, the England's Royal Navy lost 13 ships, while the Dutch lost none. Number 15. A favorable peace. The daring Dutch raid on the Medway accomplished all that its planners had hoped for. It inflicted serious material losses upon England's Royal Navy. It also publicly demonstrated that the English were unable to protect their own coastline or their own fleet within their own borders. It was one of the greatest humiliations ever suffered by the Royal Navy and England. So great was the debacle that there were rife speculations about the imminent collapse of the monarchy. It had been restored only 7 years earlier, after a decade of rule without a king during the period of the English Commonwealth. The humiliation inflicted by the Dutch did nothing to enhance the restored monarchy's prestige. Chagrin broke, and with a monarch seated atop a tottering throne, the English hurried to sign a peace treaty favorable to the Dutch the following month, and exited the war. Number 14. A daring train jacking. It was early 1862, during the American Civil War. Union forces were worried about the possibility of Confederate troops rapidly arriving at Chattanooga from Atlanta. Using the Western and Atlantic Railroad, James Andrews, a Union civilian scout, proposed a daring raid to sever that rail connection. He and a select group of volunteers would seize a locomotive in Georgia, then travel north, destroying 2 connecting railway lines and their vital bridges along the way. Andrews' idea was approved, and in early April 1862, he recruited Union Army volunteers for his raid. Slipping through Confederate lines in civilian clothes, the men rendezvoused in Marietta, Georgia. There, they boarded a train on April 11th. When it reached a small stop called Big Shanty, selected by Andrews because it had no telegraph that the Confederates could use to send out an alarm, the raiders leapt into action. Seizing the locomotive named the General, they uncoupled it from the rest of the train and took off. It was the start of a rollicking chase. Number 13. The Great Locomotive Chase. Chugging along in their stolen train, James Andrews and his men stopped along the way to cut telegraph lines and remove some railroad tracks. Back in Big Shanty, the conductor whose locomotive they had hijacked, William Fuller, organized a pursuit. With a hue and cry raised behind them, the Union raiders led the Confederate pursuers on a 90-mile chase on locomotives and on foot. The Confederates at Big Shanty first set off by foot, then by handcart, until Fuller and his posse reached an idle locomotive on a spur line. They fired it up and began the chase in earnest. Switching locomotives along the way, Fuller and the pursuers steadily closed the distance with Andrews and his raiders. For some time, Andrews' men managed to stay ahead of news of their raid because they had cut telegraph wires, thus preventing warnings and orders to block the raiders' escape route from reaching Confederate forces ahead of the fleeing Union volunteers. For a while, things seemed to be going the daring raiders' way. However, fortune is a fickle mistress, and she eventually turned her back on them. Number 12. End of the chase. Things started going wrong for Andrews and his men when they stopped to burn a wooden railroad bridge. Unfortunately, heavy rains had left the structure too waterlogged to catch on fire, so the daring raiders gave up and moved on, leaving the bridge intact behind them. That gave their pursuers a clear path to follow them on a stern chase. When the pursuers finally reached an intact telegraph line, they sent an alert that reached Confederates ahead of the raiders, who blocked the Union volunteers. Halting the train on the outskirts of Ringgold, Georgia, Andrews ordered his men to disembark and scatter into the wilderness. They were captured over the next few days, then tried by the Confederates for acts of unlawful belligerency. Andrews and 7 of his men were convicted and hanged in June of 1862. 8 of the raiders, however, managed to escape, and the remainder were released in a prisoner exchange in March 1863. Participants in the raid were among the first ever recipients of the newly created Congressional Medal of Honor, but unfortunately Andrews was not among them because as a civilian, he was ineligible. Number 11. A wily Chinese strategist. Zhuge Liang was a wily chancellor and military strategist during China's Three Kingdoms period. One of his exploits took place in 208 during the build-up to a climactic battle between rival armies that were separated by the Yangtze River. Zhuge Liang's rivals maneuvered him into committing himself to furnish 100,000 arrows within a few days. It was a seemingly impossible task, but after mulling it over, Zhuge Liang came up with a daring plan to pull it off. He gathered a flotilla of riverboats, lined them up with bales of wet straw, and instructed the crews what he expected from them. Number 10. Getting supplies from the enemy. Zhuge Liang waited for a foggy night on the Yangtze, then quietly rowed his riverboat flotilla across the river to carry out his daring plan undetected. He positioned his riverboats in a line close to the enemy camp. Then at a signal, his crews erupted with loud noises to break the night silence, shouting, beating drums, clanging gongs, and creating an unholy din. Startled, the enemy camp awoke in a panic. Convinced that they were facing a surprise night attack, they unleashed a storm of arrows at the boat's silhouettes flitting in the murk, arrows that were embedded in the wet bales of straw, then his pin-cushion boats groaning with the weight of more than 100,000 captured arrows. Zhuge Liang departed. Number 9. The empty fort strategy. Zhuge Liang is also known for another daring bluff, which became proverbial in China as the empty fort strategy. It came about when he was tasked with defending a walled city with a severely undermanned garrison. A vastly superior enemy army approached, one against which Zhuge Liang's tiny garrison stood no chance. Rather than barricade the city gates, he threw them open. He then grabbed a musical instrument and proceeded to nonchalantly play it while seated atop the gates. When scouts informed the enemy commander what they saw, he rode to the gates and saw that they were indeed wide open. He looked up at the walls and saw that they were unmanned. While Zhuge Liang nonchalantly played music above, suspecting a trap, the enemy commander turned his army around and left the defenseless city. Number 8. A daring rescue. In the wee morning hours of July 4, 1976, Israeli special forces carried out a daring raid on Entebbe Airport in Uganda. The goal was to rescue hostages taken from an Air France jetliner. The plane had been commandeered on June 27, while en route from Tel Aviv to Paris. After a stopover in Athens where it was boarded by 4 hijackers, 2 were from a breakaway faction of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the other 2 were from a German Red Army faction revolutionary cell. Seizing the airplane, the hijackers diverted it to Entebbe Airport in Uganda, whose President Idi Amin was sympathetic to their cause. Once landed at Entebbe, the hijackers removed the passengers from the airplane to a disused airport terminal building. There, they were joined by another 3 accomplices. After sifting through the passengers' passports, the hostage-takers released those who were neither Israeli nor Jewish, and kept as hostages 94 who were plus 12 members of the Air France air crew. In exchange for freeing their hostages, hijackers demanded the release of 40 prisoners held in Israel, plus another 13 held in other countries. Number 7. Success. As the days passed and the prisoners were not released, the hijackers grew more strident and incessant. and threatened to kill their hostages if their demands were not met. Fortunately for the Israelis, an Israeli engineer who had worked with Idi Amin in the 1960s furnished them with the blueprints of the Entebbe terminal building, where the hostages were being kept. They used those blueprints to plan a rescue mission. On the night of July 3, 1976, 100 Israeli special forces boarded C-130 cargo planes and, escorted by F-4 Phantoms, took off on a 2,500-mile flight to Uganda. Within 90 minutes of touching down at Entebbe, the commandos had killed all 7 hostage takers, along with about 45 Ugandan soldiers, and destroyed 30 Ugandan jets at the airport. In exchange, they lost 1 commando killed and 5 wounded, plus 3 dead and 10 wounded hostages. Commandos and hostages then boarded the C-130 transports for a short flight to Nairobi, Kenya. There, the planes refueled and the wounded were taken to an awaiting hospital plane before flying back to Israel. Number 6. A daring scheme to seize a bridge. In 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte conducted the Ulm campaign, a series of daring maneuvers that culminated in the capture of an entire Austrian army. Austria's Russian allies had sent an army, but it did not arrive in time to save the trapped Austrians. The Russians retreated to the north bank of the Danube, hoping for breathing space to regroup by putting that river between them and the pursuing French. To that end, all bridges spanning the Danube were either blown up or rigged with explosives to detonate at a word of command to prevent their capture by Napoleon's forces. In the meantime, as the French neared the Austrian capital of Vienna on the Danube, peace negotiations were underway. The Austrians did not immediately blow up Vienna's bridges, because they did not want to cast a pall over the negotiations. They also figured it might prove unnecessary if the negotiators succeed in reaching a peaceful settlement. Vienna's bridges were prepared for detonation if the French tried to seize them. One such was the Tabor Bridge, entrusted to a Count Auersperg. Unfortunately for the Austrians, Count Auersperg ended up falling for a daring ruse that allowed the French to seize the bridge placed under his command. Number 5. A daring duo. As the French army advanced upon Vienna, there was a mood of uncertainty in the air. The war was still on, but the hostilities might end at any moment with an armistice and peace treaty. It was against that backdrop that the French vanguard neared the Tabor Bridge on November 13, 1805 and halted. 2 of Napoleon's more daring generals, Joachim Murat and Jean Lannes, then casually ambled at the bridge, behaving in a carefree manner, as confused Austrian guards aimed their muskets at their breasts. The French commanders were laughing and expressing their pleasure at the just concluded armistice and peace treaty. Once they reached the other side, still seemingly without a care in the world, they asked to see Count Auersperg, wondering if he had already gone to attend the peace signing ceremony. Number 4. A daring ruse. As a messenger was sent to fetch Count Auersperg, Generals Lannes and Murat chatted with the guards to distract them from paying attention to French soldiers, who were now casually crossing the bridge. An Austrian sergeant suspected a ruse and lit the fuse to the explosives. However, Lannes extinguished it. The daring French general berated the sergeant for trying to destroy public property, then sat on a cannon as he smoked a pipe. When Count Auersperg arrived, he bought the Frenchman's story. When the suspicious Austrian sergeant protested, Murat, just as daring as Lannes, berated Auersperg for his soldiers' indiscipline, and for allowing an underling to mouth off and jeopardize the armistice. Auersperg was browbeaten into arresting the sergeant, then turned control of the bridge over to the French. They used it to cross the Danube, and less than a month later crushed the combined Austro-Russian armies at Austerlitz, the masterpiece battle of Napoleon's career. A court-martial convicted the hapless Count Auersperg of incompetence and negligence, stripped him of his rank and honors, and sentenced him to be shot. Luckily for him, the sentence was commuted and he was eventually pardoned. Number 3. Taking daring to a whole new level. There is regular daring, which is exceptional and badass in of itself. Then there is shouting defiance against tyranny and oppression while the oppressive tyrant's noose is around one's neck type of daring, which takes things to another level. Stepan Filipovic managed to pull off a ladder in World War II, when he shouted to a gathered crowd, "Death to fascism, freedom to the people." With a Nazi noose around his neck, they were his last words on earth, just a split second before his execution. Number 2. Joining the anti-fascist fight. Stepan Filipovic was a Croatian who was born in 1916 in what became Yugoslavia after World War I. He left home at 16 and became a metalworker. In 1937, he joined the local workers' movement and became an activist member. Arrested for political activity, Filipovic was sentenced to a year in jail. Imprisonment only served to further radicalize him, and upon his release in 1940 Filipovic joined the Communist Party. In 1941, Germany invaded and overran Yugoslavia. Filipovic volunteered to join the partisan resistance against the Nazi occupiers, and was posted to a guerrilla unit near Valjevo, in today's Serbia. Given responsibility for recruitment and for securing arms, he excelled in his duties, showed so much promise and displayed so much daring, that by year's end he had risen to command an entire partisan battalion. Number 1. Daring defiance in the face of death. Stjepan Filipovic was captured by the Nazis in February 1942, and was sentenced to be publicly hanged in Valjevo's town square at death's door. Stjepan Filipovic had the courage and presence of mind to seize the moment, and defy his captors during his last seconds on earth. Mounting the gallows, and with a hangman's noose around his neck, he daringly thrust his hands in the air and struck a dramatic pose that was captured on camera. Urging the gathered crowd to continue the struggle against the Nazi oppressors and their Yugoslav collaborators, he cried out just before he was hanged, "Death to fascism, freedom to the people," a pre-existing partisan slogan that Filipovic's martyrdom helped popularize. After the war, Filipovic was designated a national hero of Yugoslavia. A monumental statue was erected in Valjevo in his honor, replicating his Y-shaped pose in an artistically classic rendition reminiscent of a Goya painting.